In our international affairs editor, Armen Georgian. Armen, this crisis which we're seeing unfold in Sri Lanka didn't just happen overnight, but it's been brewing for months, some may even say even years.
Well, the government is blaming the COVID pandemic, which admittedly has hit Sri Lanka's hard currency reserves, because it gets a lot of those from tourism. And actually, even before COVID, there was the bombings in April 2019, which already led tourism to plunge. So there's some truth to that. But of course, a lot of Sri Lanka watchers would point to more deep structural problems involving economic mismanagement over months or years, as you said in your introduction, Delano, and arguably that mismanagement played a big part in Sri Lanka defaulting on its payments this April. So there's this big debt problem, which has been getting worse even since April. When you combine that with problems in food security internationally, partly exacerbated by Ukraine, of course, then you've got a perfect storm. You've got the debt problem and these internal political mistakes, if you will, and the external economic shocks. You put those two together, you've got this perfect storm leading to these rising prices for fuel, basic goods and so forth, that is, of course, playing into this anger on the streets. And that is going to be a very complex thing for any future government in Sri Lanka to untangle. So obviously what we're seeing is these problems that have piled up on top of each other are bigger than the mere question of, does President Rajapaksa stay or go?
And clearly, this crisis in Sri Lanka is going to have its neighbors taking notice, most notably China and India.
Yeah, they're the two key players, really, and also both regional rivals, it's worth reminding everybody, India and China. India, of course, always affected by what happens in Sri Lanka. We saw during the civil war, Sri Lankans fleeing the country, coming to Indian shores. There have now been, instead, migrants coming from Sri Lanka as a result of this food crisis in Sri Lanka, so for different reasons than during the Sri Lankan civil war. At the same time, we've also seen Indian officials in a sense, trying to pull Sri Lanka away from Chinese influence against the backdrop of this economic crisis in Sri Lanka, trying to doing their part to offer to help the Sri Lankan economy. Recently, we saw an energy project that had been meant to go to China actually being sort of wrested away by the Indian authorities. But having said that, overall, it has to be said Sri Lanka is still very linked to China economically, because it's drawn in billions in investment under the Belt and Road Initiative. So how much of an in India now has is going to depend a lot on what China decides to do next. And here China has a lot of dilemmas. So does it ultimately accede to these Sri Lankan requests for a major new credit line? And most controversially of all, does it agree to a restructuring of Sri Lanka's debt? So far, the noises being made by the Chinese embassy there is not very positive on this. But of course, the dilemma is either China doesn't accede to these requests and perhaps loses influence to its rivals, including India, or it does accede one day to these requests and then create a precedent which it doesn't want to set for other countries that China has helped.
Armen, thank you very much for that. Armen Georgian there.